I just recently uploaded a video going over what we think are the drop rates for purples in Tombs of Amascut, and since I just did that and talked about what invocation levels I thought were best for getting purples, I thought what better time than now to give you some invocation setups that you can use if you're struggling to find a good setup. Once again though, there's a lot of speculation involved in figuring out what invocation levels are good, so take it as you will. Now in this video I'll be going over invocations all the way from 50 to 540, so hopefully I've got everyone covered, but first a couple disclaimers which are pretty important. First off, most of my experiences with solos, so the invocations will be mostly focused on solos. They can be modified for teams, of course, but there are some differences. For example, in Kefri, Aerial Assault is a lot more annoying in a team, while more Overlords and Medic are a lot less annoying. Also, Mind the Gap can be a bit more annoying depending on your team. Second disclaimer is that everything here is not meant to be taken as a rule. They are more like guidelines, really, and they are meant to be modified and built off of and changed out as you will and how they fit your needs. So don't take these at just face value, try and fit them into how you like to play and how you do your raids. So I'm going to start with what I think is the actual money level, which is 400 raids. Now if you don't know why I think that, in my previous video, looking at the raw data, going from 300 to 400 over doubles your drop rate for a purple. For context, at 300 you're looking at about a little over 4% drop rate, or a 1 out of 24-ish, and at 400 you're looking at a 1 in 11 drop rate. So that's a crazy increase, and if you go all the way up to 500s, it seems to only go up to around a 1 in 9, which is of course great, but 400s are so much easier than 500s and can be done faster, and there's less chance of death. So what I think is that unless you're really good at 500s, 400s looks like the way to go, but you're free to disagree with that, it's up to you. Either way, one of the great things about this raid is how customizable it is. So if you're doing 400 raids, I've actually come up with 3 different setups depending on what you want to do. I'm going to start with what I call the standard setup, and I call it that simply because it has a little mix of everything. So you've got Insanity, of course, just a good selection of invocations in most rooms that are pretty easy to deal with, comparatively at least. You have Deadly Prayers, and you have a few path mechanics, so you gotta make sure you know your paths, but otherwise there's nothing too special. I don't restrict the supplies you use, and of course some of you are gonna be able to do this in 40 minutes. I personally can't, it takes me a little longer than 40, but if you can do it in below 40 or even 35, you should definitely turn those invocations on. One note about Upset Stomach though is that you have to be very comfortable with the Croc if you're taking that, especially if you go last, because if you go last, he's going to be level 4 and just machine gunning you. Plus, Upset Stomach can really screw around with the acid and the jugs, so you either, in this case, have to do Croc first, or you have to be very comfortable doing Croc last. Now my next invocation setup for 400 I'm going to show you is for all you sweaty gamers out there. That's the people who are doing Butterfly, Red X, or even if you're not doing any of that stuff, you have a yellow Karis and you're not afraid to use it. So this one definitely requires a yellow Karis, but it basically uses no help needed and dehydration for a huge 70 points, and then the rest of it is geared at going as fast as possible. And once again, if you can make the times, you should definitely use them. So the main gist of this one is that I tried to avoid as many of the path mechanics as possible, and then this one is just like you try to blaze through it, and you're skilled enough to only rely on your yellow Karis for health, as well as maybe a Blood Fury. Okay, my last 300 setup is maybe the most forgiving of all of them. This one uses no Insanity, and also uses no help needed, so you are going to need a yellow Karis as well if you want to run this one. The idea behind this one is that it mostly relies on path invocations for your levels. It doesn't use Insanity, and the reason why is just because this one is the safest, so it's harder to wipe at the very end of the raid. I know for me, it is so frustrating wiping at the end of the raid, and Insanity makes that a lot harder because it makes Wardens rip away the tiles a lot faster. It's actually quite a cakewalk without Insanity at the very end, if you're used to it, of course. So this is, I think, the most forgiving out of all of them, and you still have a little bit of potions from no help needed. You'll have an Ambrosia if you take life, so you won't entirely have to rely on the Karis spec. The other thing too is that you can bring in some of your own brews and restores as supplies, but one thing you have to keep in mind is that you may have to carry over the salt boost. So you'd have to use 1 salt for both of your last rooms, and it's probably going to run out in one of the rooms, so you'll have to just like not brew and carry over the salt, because the boost stays even after the salt wears off. So you can do an entire raid off of only one salt pack, but it is a bit trickier and you're going to need to keep that in mind. And finally, here's a little table showing what the estimated drop rate is and how long you might expect to take for a purple based on how long you take to complete a raid. Okay, so with 400s out of the way, I'm now just going to go in ascending order on invocation levels. So let's start off with 50. First note, if you're doing 50s, they're honestly pretty bad for purples. They have a 0.73% chance of getting you a purple, and it just so much better if you go all the way up to 150, because that increases your purple chance all the way up to 2%, and not only that, it gets you access to all of the purples and not just the Fang and the Light Bearer, although yes, you can get the others, but they're about 100 times rarer than normal, so take that as you will. Either way, I put try again, that gives you 10 tries and it's just some points. I mean, it's kind of whatever. All of these invocations are super free and they barely change anything. Blowing Mud, it changes literally nothing in a solo. The Krondis ones or whatever, shaking things up, actually makes it a bit easier to react to Baba's AoE attack, so that's all for the 50s. And once again, here is what you might look like, the time it might take to get a purple at 50, depending on how fast you do the raid. Okay, 150s normal mode. Now, people who are very experienced are going to look at me selecting walk for it, which is the 40-minute timer, and they might laugh at that, but remember, people who are doing 150s for purples are probably like lower in a lower stage of their account, and that's not flame or anything, that's just like we all got to start from somewhere, right? So if you're at the stage where you're considering farming 150s for purples, then you probably need a bit more time to complete the raid, and if you can't complete walk for it, then you can take it off, or if you can, then, you know, move it up however you want to do it. And then these are, once again, just extremely free invocations. The only one of note is like Overclock 2, which makes it so the Warden attack speed is like once every 2.4 seconds, same as like a Dragon Scimitar or Whip. And this is so manageable. Like, if you haven't done it before, it might seem scary at first, but it is very, very easy. Trust me, you'll be fine. Oh yeah, I guess I should also note that on a diet makes it so you can't eat hard food like sharks, so you'll only be able to bring in brews. Here's my setup for 250s. Remember, these are just guidelines. You don't have to be doing exactly 250s, you could be doing 230s, 280s, whatever you want. So this one starts using some of the path mechanics, and for the path mechanics, they increase the health of your bosses that you fight as the raid goes on. So if you haven't watched my previous video or seen the Reddit post, basically more health equals more damage dealt equals higher purple chance, so that's all good around. And then besides that, most of the invocations are pretty much the same as the 150 setup, just with the path mechanics. Also, you might have to take a bit of time learning how to face bosses, since every 2 levels they get new mechanics, or their mechanics get like faster or harder. So if you're unfamiliar with that, you should start at like a lower level and just add walk the path and see what happens. Okay, now let's dip our toes into expert mode. Here's a setup for 300, and this is a speed setup, so we're doing no path mechanics, no increased health, we're trying to go as fast as possible. I feel like this is especially better in a group, because a group can go very, very fast, and the risk of death doesn't really matter since you'd have to have everyone die in order to wipe. There are some pretty big newcomers here that you have to add in order to avoid doing the paths. One important one is Feeling Special, which makes Akka's special attack, the memory special, a lot faster. It also makes his detonate attack in groups cover more directions. So a pretty dangerous one, but 20 points is so much. If you really can't deal with it though, you could swap it out for Deadly Prayers and just bring more prayer potions, it's fine. Upset Stomach is also pretty dangerous because Croc can be a bit of an asshole sometimes, so you can either save this by going Croc first, or if you go Croc last, just make sure you're comfortable with Upset Stomach, or at least someone on your team is. Mind the Gap can also be swapped out with Boulder Dash if you are uncomfortable doing Mind the Gap. Now here's a 300 setup with some path mechanics so that you can increase your drop rate and avoid insanity if that scares you. We have Path Seeker and Walk the Path, of course. You can change that to Pathfinder if you're more comfortable with it, but that does add some minutes and difficulty to the raid. And then otherwise it's pretty much the same. You have some points to work with as well, so I personally took off Mind the Gap, but you have points to work with. Like I said, you can bump it a little up or down if you want, so up to you. And of course another chart showing what it might look like getting a purple at 300. Now let's look at some 350s, okay? So as a disclaimer, there is nothing special about the number 350, it's just like a mid 300 setup, and this one you probably do want to tweak around to exactly where you want it. So this one for speed is pretty much the same as the last one, for 300, except you have Walk the Path on, and that one gives a whole 50 points, so it's huge, and it actually increases the difficulty of the raid by less than Pathfinder or Pathmaster would be, simply because it gives less levels, which is kind of weird. But either way, it's a pretty free one when you're trying to get up in the ranks, so definitely take that. Okay, now for the Path setup for 350, kind of same as before, except you'll put on Pathfinder instead of just Pathseeker, and then add on Deadly Prayers on top of that, and you'll need to bring an extra prayer potion or two to compensate for that. Otherwise, this looks pretty good for 350. For the estimated time to purple, I didn't split up the Path version versus the speed version, simply because we don't have the data on it, so I don't want to make some ballpark estimate that could be completely wrong. That's the only reason why I keep it together this time, so keep in mind that with a Path it might be a little better. Okay, final stretch guys. This is entering territory that I have never done. I've never done a 500, so you can take this with a grain of salt. These setups I pulled from streamers that I've seen doing 500s, so I find it to be probably pretty reliable, but I don't know, you might feel differently. So you can get to 500 without using Pathmaster, which will make it a little bit easier, but the ones you really want to avoid are Quiet Prayers and Medic if you're in a solo, although you can put on Medic in a team. Upset Stomach I just turned off because we have some extra points left over, and so you could turn off Upset Stomach, you could turn off more Overlords, it doesn't really matter. You want to make sure you avoid the really bad ones, and then pretty much everything else is on. Of course, you're going to need a yellow Karis for this one. If you don't have one, you'll need to do a run with dehydration off, so keep that in mind. And then we also have this 540 setup, which I've seen Lake use a lot. By the way, if you don't know who Lake is, he is insane at the game. He does 540s all day, every day on Twitch whenever he's streaming, so at least as of the time of making this video, and I've been watching him a lot. He's just ridiculously good at raids and RuneScape in general, so shout out Lake, and he's the one I got this Invocation setup from. So for this setup, you basically just have everything on except the worst of the worst, which is Quiet Prayers and Medic. You obviously need to be insanely good at the game in order to pull this off, but just putting this out there in case you're curious, or some of you can do this setup. I've heard Lake say that he really likes this setup, and this seems to be the highest viable setup to go with. So I personally trust in him, and I'm putting this out there. But as for the drop rates, the reason why I don't include 540 is simply because there is not data on 540. There's like 49 data points, so we have no idea. Even for 500, it's pretty low, but it seems to be around an 11.3% chance, which is great. So I'm just putting in what we know, and I don't want to speculate on what 540 might or might not be. Okay, and that is all for this video, I promise. Thank you for sitting through it. I hope this helps some of you. If you disagree with some of my invocation choices, feel free. There's a lot of ways you can go about this raid. So just let me know if you have any problems, or if you have any better invocation setups. Good luck, guys.